The painting you're looking at right now was created in 1841, and its title is Pandemonium. In it, we see Satan himself standing on a cluster of jagged black rocks, surrounded by rivers of molten lava that glow orange and red against the darkness. He is not raging. He is not screaming in defiance. Instead, he stands perfectly still, observing what he has built with an expression that almost resembles satisfaction, or perhaps resignation. It is difficult to tell. Behind him rises the greatest palace ever constructed in hell, a massive Gothic structure that dominates the center of the composition, its towers and arches stretching upward into a sky choked with pollution and storm clouds. The architecture is intricate, covered in ornamental details that would take hours to fully catalogue. And at the base of this palace, a series of enormous arches lift the entire structure above the flowing river of fire, as if the whole thing is hovering over the inferno, held up by nothing but dark ambition. In the distance, barely visible as individuals, we see armies, thousands upon thousands of figures marching in perfect formation across the hellish landscape. They move toward the palace in organized rows, like a military parade or religious procession. They are not fleeing, they are not suffering, they are celebrating, worshipping, waiting for permission to approach their leader and the monument he has created. And above it all, cutting through the toxic atmosphere, a bolt of lightning tears across the sky, as if the heavens themselves are acknowledging this infernal occasion. This is Pandemonium, the capital of hell, painted by British artist John Martin in 1841. And when it was first exhibited at the Royal Academy in London, critics called it excessive, ridiculous, the fevered imagination of a madman obsessed with apocalyptic spectacle. But here is what they did not know, what they could not see, what Martin deliberately hid in plain sight. This painting is not a fantasy about hell. Every single detail you are looking at, every architectural element, every atmospheric effect, every symbolic choice Martin made was based on something real, something he saw in his own city, something that was happening around him while everyone else refused to acknowledge it. That palace rising from rivers of fire, it is a real building, one you would recognize immediately if you knew where to look. That polluted sky choking the atmosphere, that was London in 1841. Those masses marching in organized worship toward their own destruction, those were British citizens. John Martin did not paint the capital of hell. He painted the capital of the British Empire. And he was saying they were the same thing. By the time you finish watching this, you will see London in every brushstroke. You will understand why Martin painted this, why he chose these specific details, why he was right about everything, and why, when he tried to warn people, they called him insane instead of listening. This is not just a painting. It is a prophecy. It is a warning. It is a documentary about what happens when a society chooses power over progress, wealth over health, and comfort over truth. And it all starts with what you are looking at right now. Let's begin. In the immediate foreground of this painting, emerging from absolute darkness, we see the figure who built all of this, Satan himself. But before we talk about who he is or what he represents, we need to look at exactly how Martin painted him, because the details here tell us everything about what this painting actually means. He stands on a cluster of jagged black rocks that jut out from the flowing lava like the broken teeth of some enormous creature. These are not smooth, decorative stones. They are sharp, angular, violent in their geometry. The kind of rocks that would cut your hands if you tried to climb them. Martin has rendered them with harsh, aggressive brushstrokes that make them feel genuinely dangerous even in paint. And perched on top of these rocks, separated from everything else in the composition by the river of fire flowing beneath him, is Satan. His posture is what strikes you first. He is not crouched in rage. He is not cowering in defeat. He is standing upright, almost regal in his bearing, surveying what he has created with the calm authority of a king observing his kingdom. His body is turned slightly away from us, angled toward the palace in the distance. But his face, if you look closely at the shadowed features Martin has given him, shows something unexpected. This is not the face of triumph. This is not the expression of someone who has achieved everything they wanted and feels satisfied by it. There is something closer to contemplation there, or perhaps weariness, as if he is asking himself a question he cannot answer. Was this worth it? Is this what I wanted? He built the greatest palace in hell, gathered armies of followers, established an empire in the darkness, and now he stands alone on these rocks, separated from it all by a river of molten fire, watching but not participating. Notice his isolation. He's not surrounded by his followers. He's not being celebrated or worshipped in this moment. The masses are marching toward the palace, not toward him. He has deliberately positioned himself apart from what he created, maintaining distance, as if he cannot quite bring himself to enter his own kingdom. And surrounding him, flowing beneath these rocks and stretching away toward the palace in the background, is the river itself. This churning, bubbling current of molten lava that glows with intense orange and red light against the surrounding darkness. The surface is not smooth. It boils and churns like something alive, like something angry. Steam rises from it in thick plumes that blend into the polluted atmosphere above. But here is what makes this detail so significant. What separates John Martin from other artists who painted biblical or mythological scenes. This lava is not generic hellfire. This is not a stylized, decorative representation of heat and danger. Martin has painted this river with geological precision. Look at the way the molten rock flows around obstacles in its path. Look at how the surface texture changes where the current moves faster or slower. Look at the way light reflects off the liquid stone, creating gradations of color from deep red in the shadows to bright orange where the heat is most intense. This is based on real observation. Martin studied volcanoes. He sketched geological formations. He understood exactly how molten rock behaves, how it moves, how it looks when it is flowing versus when it is cooling. Why would an artist painting hell care about geological accuracy? Why does it matter if the lava flows correctly according to actual physics? Because this is not fantasy. Everything in this painting, even the parts that seem impossible or supernatural, is grounded in reality. Martin is not imagining what hell might look like. He's showing you something real, something that exists, something you could find if you knew where to look. And the river flowing beneath Satan's feet, separating him from his palace, keeping him isolated on these rocks while his followers march toward the structure he built. That river is real. It flows through London. And by the end of this, you will know exactly which river it is. But before we get there, we need to look at what Satan is staring at. We need to examine the palace itself, because that structure rising from the lava in the center of this composition is the key to understanding everything Martin was trying to say. Now shift your focus to the structure itself, the palace rising from the molten river in the center of this composition. This is what Satan has built. This is pandemonium. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer verticality of it. This building does not spread horizontally across the landscape. It thrusts upward, reaching toward that polluted sky with an aggressive, vertical emphasis that makes it feel less like architecture and more like a challenge, like something defying gravity itself. Every element of the design pulls your eye upward. The columns, the towers, the arches, everything points toward heaven while being firmly rooted in hell. The facade is dominated by a rhythmic colonnade, row after row of Gothic revival arches marching across the face of the building in perfect mathematical precision. These are not random decorative elements. They follow a strict pattern, a visual rhythm that repeats with mechanical consistency. Each arch is identical in proportion to the ones beside it. Each column stands at exactly the same distance from its neighbors. This is not organic architecture. This is calculated, engineered, industrial in its precision. And these arches are not shallow relief carved into stone. They are deep. three-dimensional, creating actual shadows in the recesses between the columns. Martin has painted them with enough depth that you can see how the light from the lava below illuminates their undersides, while the upper portions remain in shadow. This creates a striped pattern of light and dark running horizontally across the building, contrasting with the vertical thrust of the overall composition. Look at the surface ornamentation. Every available space is covered in carved details. Intricate patterns worked into the stone. Decorative elements that would require teams of skilled craftsmen years to complete. The level of detail is almost obsessive. Martin has rendered individual carved flourishes on a structure that must be hundreds of feet tall, painting decorations that would be barely visible to someone actually standing at the base of this building. But here is what makes the architectural design so specific, so deliberate. At the very bottom of the palace, where it meets the river of lava, there is a series of massive arches. These are different from the colonnade above. These are structural, load-bearing. They span the width of the molten river, lifting the entire palace above the flowing fire like a bridge. These arches are not decorative. They are functional. They hold the weight of everything above them. And Martin has painted them with enough engineering accuracy that you can see how the stress would distribute through the stonework, how the thrust of each arch would be transferred down into its supports, how the whole structure maintains equilibrium despite sitting on top of rivers of molten rock. This is not how artists typically paint imaginary buildings in hell. This is how architects draw real structures, with attention to load distribution, with concern for how weight transfers through masonry, with understanding of what makes a building stand versus what makes it collapse. And if you look closely at the carved details on the facade, at the decorative elements worked into the stone, you might notice something. There appear to be serpentine forms worked into the ornamentation. Snakes or dragons winding through the Gothic tracery. Not obvious, not dominating the design, but there, present, a subtle corruption of what might otherwise pass for a cathedral or government building. Now consider the scale. Look at those masses of figures marching toward the palace in the distance. Each one is barely visible as an individual. They are rendered as tiny marks of paint, suggestions of human forms rather than fully realized people. And there are thousands of them. Martin has painted thousands of individual figures, each one microscopic in the overall composition. This tells us how enormous this palace actually is. If those figures are human-sized, and they appear as mere specks against the facade, then this structure must be massive, hundreds of feet tall at minimum, perhaps over 1,000. The kind of scale that would dwarf any actual building constructed in the 1840s. Except, there is something familiar about this design. Something you might recognize if you have ever been to London. If you have ever walked along the Thames and looked up at the buildings lining its banks. This is not ancient architecture. This is not some fantasy of what medieval castles or Roman temples might have looked like. This is modern construction. This is the architectural language of the 1840s, specifically the Gothic revival style that was sweeping through British architecture at exactly the moment Martin painted this. The vertical emphasis, the rhythmic colonnade, the ornamental surface details, the arches lifting the structure above water. These are not generic features of palatial design. These are specific, deliberate, recognizable. Martin did not invent this building. He copied it. He modified it. He placed it over rivers of fire and added serpents to the carvings, and scaled it up to inhuman proportions. But the basic structure, the architectural DNA of what you're looking at, came from somewhere real. And once you see it, once you recognize what building this is based on, the entire painting transforms. Everything Satan is looking at. Everything those masses are marching toward. Everything Martin spent months carefully rendering in oils and varnish. It is not in hell. It is in London. And it still stands today. Above all of this, filling the upper third of the composition, is the sky, or what remains of it. This is not the clean darkness of night. This is not the theatrical gloom of storm clouds gathering before rain. This is pollution. This is contamination. This is the atmosphere itself rendered toxic by whatever processes created this hellish landscape. The color is wrong. Skies should be blue or grey or black. But this sky is sickly yellow. Greenish in places. As if the air itself has become chemically altered. As if invisible poisons are suspended in the atmosphere, changing how light refracts through the particles choking the upper regions of this world. The clouds are thick, heavy. They hang in the air like something semi-solid, like they have weight and mass beyond what water vapor should possess. They do not float, they press down, they suffocate, and they are not uniform in texture. Some areas are smooth and dense, impenetrable to light. Other sections are wispy, torn apart by wind or chemical reactions, or the heat rising from below. And cutting through all of this, tearing across the composition from one side to the other, is that bolt of lightning. It is not a clean line of electricity. It branches, it fractures, it splits into multiple paths as it searches for the ground, for anything that will complete the circuit and release the energy building in those toxic clouds. The light from this lightning illuminates the underside of the clouds, revealing their three-dimensional structure, showing how they layer and overlap and compress against each other. And what it reveals is disturbing, because these clouds are not natural. They are not formed by water condensing in the atmosphere. They are formed by smoke, by ash, by the chemical byproducts of fire and industry and whatever terrible processes are at work in this landscape. Look at how the light from the lava below interacts with the light from the lightning above. They create competing illumination sources. The orange glow from the river fights with the white flash from the sky. And in the areas where they overlap, where both light sources hit the same surfaces, the colors become confused, muddy, wrong. This is an atmosphere that has been fundamentally corrupted. The air itself has become a hazard. Breathing this would damage your lungs. Standing in this would make your eyes burn. The particles suspended in this atmosphere are not water. They are not dust. They are toxic, industrial. The residue of combustion and chemical reactions and processes that should not be happening in nature. And here is what Martin wants you to understand. What he painted with such obsessive accuracy that you cannot miss it once you see it. This is not what hell looks like in mythology. This is not the classical underworld of Greek philosophy or the fire and brimstone of medieval theology. This is not Dante's Inferno or Milton's Paradise Lost. Though Martin knew both texts intimately, this is what London looked like in 1841. That sickly yellow-green haze choking the sky. That was the colour of London's air on bad days, when the coal smoke from thousands of factories and homes combined with fog rolling off the Thames to create what residents called pea soup. A toxic mixture that killed hundreds of people every winter. Those organised masses marching in formation, those were British citizens going about their daily routines, following the pattern society had established for them, participating in systems they did not question because everyone else was participating too. That palace rising above the pollution, beautiful and ornate and completely inaccessible to the people below, that was real. That was being built right now, in 1841, while Martin was painting this. While he was watching construction crews work on the banks of the Thames, building something that would become the symbol of British power for the next 2 centuries. Everything in this painting is real. And the painting you are looking at is not hanging in some obscure private collection where only scholars can study it. It hangs in the Louvre, in Paris, where millions of people walk past it every year without realizing what they're seeing. It is time to tell you what that palace actually is. The palace you are looking at is the British Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, the seat of government for the most powerful empire on earth in 1841. The building where laws were written and policies were enacted and decisions were made that affected millions of people across continents. And John Martin painted it as the capital of hell. This is not interpretation. This is not a loose visual similarity that you could argue either way. Martin deliberately, precisely, methodically copied the architectural design of the Palace of Westminster, made specific modifications to emphasize his point, and placed the entire structure over rivers of molten fire, with Satan himself observing from the foreground. Let me show you exactly how he did it. In 1834, the old Palace of Westminster burned down. Nearly the entire medieval complex was destroyed in a fire that Londoners could see from miles away. The building that had housed Parliament for centuries was gone. Britain needed a new one. They held a competition. Architects from across the country submitted designs, and in 1836, the commission was awarded to Charles Barry, who proposed a massive Gothic revival structure that would become one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. Construction began in 1840. Martin painted Pandemonium in 1841. He was literally watching them build it while he painted this. He could walk to the construction site from his studio. He could see the Gothic arches taking shape. He could observe the vertical proportions, the rhythmic colonnade, the ornamental surface details that would define Barry's design, and he transferred every single one of those elements into this painting of hell. Look at the construction engraving from 1842. This is what the Palace of Westminster looked like while it was being built. You can see the wooden scaffolding covering the structure, the workers moving across the platforms, the Thames flowing in front of it. This is the building Martin saw taking shape in real time. Now look at the rhythm of the arches. Count them if you want. Notice how they repeat at regular intervals along the facade, creating that striped pattern of light and shadow running horizontally across the building. Each arch is identical in proportion to the ones beside it. Each column stands at exactly the same distance from its neighbors. This is Barry's signature design element: mathematical precision. Gothic revival meets industrial engineering. Look at Pandemonium again. Look at the palace facade rising from the lava. You will see the exact same pattern, the exact same rhythm, the exact same spacing between columns. Martin copied it. Not approximately. Not in the general style of Gothic architecture. He copied this specific building's specific architectural language. The vertical emphasis is identical. Both buildings thrust upward with aggressive height, using Gothic pointed arches and vertical lines to pull the eye toward the sky. This was deliberate in Barry's design. He wanted Parliament to dominate the London skyline, to tower over surrounding structures to project power through sheer vertical scale. Westminster was designed to look important, to look permanent, to look like it would stand for centuries. Martin preserved that vertical thrust. He exaggerated it. He made the palace in Pandemonium even taller, even more imposing, pushing the proportions beyond what was structurally feasible in the real world. But the underlying architectural language is the same. The vocabulary is Westminster. The grammar is Barry's Gothic revival. The message is unmistakable. The surface ornamentation matches. Both buildings are covered in carved Gothic details. Tracery, pinnacles, decorative stonework that would require years of skilled labor to complete. Barry's design called for intricate carving across every available surface, turning the building into a showcase of Victorian craftsmanship and wealth. This was not just architecture, this was propaganda in stone. A statement that Britain had the resources, the skill, the cultural sophistication to build the most elaborate government building in the world. Martin painted that same ornamental excess. He rendered those same Gothic flourishes. And then he added serpents, subtle corruptions of the decorative program, dragons winding through the tracery where Barry would have placed angels or heraldic symbols. The same beauty, the same technical mastery, but with something rotten hidden in the details. But here is the element that makes Martin's intent absolutely undeniable: the arches at the base. The real Palace of Westminster sits on the north bank of the River Thames. Part of Barry's design included a river terrace an embankment where the building meets the water, and supporting that terrace, lifting the main structure above the river level, are a series of Gothic arches, structural arches that span the distance between the building's foundation and the water below. Look at the construction engraving again. You can see those arches being built. You can see how they lift the palace above the Thames, creating a continuous arcade along the waterfront. This was both functional and symbolic. The arches protected the foundation from flooding while creating a dramatic visual statement. Parliament rising above the river. Government elevated above the common flow. Now look at Pandemonium. Martin painted those exact same arches, the same proportions, the same structural logic, the same relationship between building and water. But instead of spanning the Thames, they span rivers of molten lava. Instead of lifting Parliament above clean water, they lift Pandemonium above hell's infernal currents. The comparison is not subtle. Martin did not hint at this connection. He did not suggest it through vague architectural similarities. He copied the building. He made it obvious to anyone who had seen the construction site or read about Barry's design in the newspapers. He wanted you to see it. And if you look at the Palace of Westminster today, almost 200 years after Martin painted this, you will see that nothing has changed. The building still stands on the Thames. The Gothic arches still march in rhythm along the facade. The vertical towers still thrust toward the sky. The ornamental details still cover every surface. Martin painted the future. He painted what Westminster would look like when it was finished. And he painted it burning in hell. In 1841, when this painting was first exhibited at the Royal Academy, everyone who saw it would have known exactly which building this was. The Palace of Westminster was the most talked about construction project in Britain. It was in the newspapers constantly. Artists were sketching it. Engineers were debating the technical challenges. The public was fascinated by it. So when John Martin unveiled a painting of Satan's palace in hell, and that palace looked exactly like the building currently being constructed to house the British government, people understood what he was saying. Some critics were horrified. They called it offensive, blasphemous, an insult to national pride and parliamentary dignity. How dare an artist suggest that the seat of British power resembled the capital of hell? Other critics missed the point entirely. They praised the architectural accuracy while ignoring the political implications. They admired Martin's technical skill in rendering Gothic details while failing to ask why he chose those specific details. But Martin knew exactly what he was doing. He was not being subtle. He was not hiding his message in obscure symbolism that only scholars could decode. He was painting the most important building in Britain and labeling it Pandemonium, the capital of hell, the palace of Satan. And he was saying these are the same thing. But why? Why paint this? Why risk his reputation and career to make this statement? What was happening in 1841 that made Martin so angry, so desperate to communicate this message, that he would spend months creating this massive painting just to call the British government demonic? The answer is in that river. That river of molten lava flowing beneath Satan's feet, separating him from his palace, creating a barrier of fire between the ruler and the ruled. That river is real. It flows through London. And in 1841, it was killing thousands of people every year, while the government building Martin just painted as Pandemonium sat on its banks and did nothing. Let me tell you about the River Thames. In the 1840s, the River Thames was not a river. It was an open sewer. Every day, millions of gallons of human waste flowed directly into the water from cesspits and privies across London. Every factory, every slaughterhouse, every tannery and dye works dumped their chemical runoff straight into the current. Dead animals floated past the Houses of Parliament. The water ran brown and thick with contamination. And on hot summer days, the smell was so overwhelming that people on the riverbanks would vomit from the stench alone. This was not hidden. This was not a secret problem that only the poor experienced in distant neighbourhoods. The Thames flowed through the centre of London. It flowed past Westminster. It flowed past the construction site where they were building the new Palace of Parliament. Everyone could see it. Everyone could smell it. Everyone knew. And it was killing them. Cholera outbreaks swept through London in waves. 1831, 1848, thousands dead, tens of thousands sick. The disease spread through contaminated water, though most doctors at the time did not understand this yet. They believed in miasma theory. They thought bad air caused illness, not polluted water. So they told people to avoid the smell, to stay indoors when the stench was particularly bad, while continuing to draw their drinking water from the same toxic river that was causing the problem. The Thames had become exactly what Martin painted in Pandemonium. A barrier of death flowing through the city. Something that should sustain life transformed into something that destroyed it. A river that had once provided fish and transportation and commerce now carried disease and poison and decay. Look at that lava flowing in the painting. Look at how it churns and bubbles with toxic energy. Look at how the steam rises from its surface, contaminating the air above. Look at how it creates an impassable barrier between Satan and his palace, between the ruler and the ruled, between those who make decisions and those who suffer the consequences. That is the Thames, and John Martin knew this better than almost anyone in Britain, because he had tried to fix it. In the 1820s and 1830s, Martin was not just a painter, he was an inventor, an engineer, a man obsessed with infrastructure and urban planning and finding practical solutions to London's growing problems. He studied the city's water systems. He analysed how waste moved through the streets and into the river. He understood that as London grew, as more people crowded into the city, the pollution would only get worse. So he designed a comprehensive sewer system for London. It was brilliant. It was detailed. It would have worked. His plan included underground brick sewers that would carry waste away from the Thames, treatment facilities that would process the sewage before it entered the water, embankments along the riverbanks to prevent flooding and control the flow. He drew up engineering specifications. He calculated costs. He presented it to city officials and members of parliament. They rejected it. Too expensive, they said. Too radical, too disruptive to implement. London had survived for centuries without such elaborate infrastructure. Why spend enormous amounts of money on a problem that might solve itself? Besides, the miasma theory suggested that the real issue was air quality, not water. Building sewers underground would not address the fundamental cause of disease. Martin argued. He wrote pamphlets. He gave speeches. He showed them the mathematics, the engineering principles, the projected death tolls if nothing changed. He explained that every year they delayed meant thousands more people would die from preventable waterborne diseases. They thanked him for his concern and did nothing. And so Martin painted. If he could not build a solution, he would paint a warning. If they would not listen to his engineering proposals, perhaps they would understand a visual message. He would show them what their city was becoming, what it already was. A palace of government rising from a river of filth. A capital built on death and disease and willful ignorance. Hell on earth. Look at Pandemonium again now. Look at that palace sitting above the lava. Beautiful and ornate and completely isolated from the consequences of its own existence. Look at those arches lifting it above the toxic flow, creating physical distance between the building and the river, as if that separation absolves those inside from responsibility for what happens below. The people who worked in the real Palace of Westminster did not drink Thames water. They had access to clean wells, to filtered sources, to private supplies that protected them from the contamination killing the city around them. They could build their Gothic palace on the riverbank and never have to confront what flowed past their windows. Just like Satan standing on his rocks, observing his kingdom from a safe distance, never having to walk through the fire himself. Martin painted what he saw, a government building rising from a poisoned river, officials making decisions in comfort while thousands died from problems they refused to address. A system that valued appearance over function, grandeur over public health, political prestige over human life. He painted Westminster as pandemonium because that is what it was. And the river flowing beneath it, rendered with geological precision, bubbling with toxic energy, creating an impassable barrier between power and people, that was not fantasy. That was documentary. That was the Thames in 1841, captured in paint and presented as prophecy. But Martin was not just documenting the present. He was predicting the future, because he knew what would happen if nothing changed. He knew the river would get worse. He knew the death toll would climb. He knew that eventually the pollution would become so severe that even those protected by privilege would be forced to acknowledge it. He was right, but it would take 17 more years and thousands more deaths before anyone listened. Now look at the painting again, knowing what you know, seeing what you could not see before. That palace rising from the darkness, covered in Gothic ornamental details, lifted above the river by those precise architectural arches. That is the British Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, the seat of the most powerful government on earth, painted as the capital of hell. That river flowing beneath it, rendered with geological accuracy, bubbling with toxic energy, separating the structure from the masses below. That is the River Thames. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. That is what the Thames looked like in 1841. A poisoned current carrying disease and death through the centre of London, while the government sat on its banks and refused to act. Those polluted clouds choking the sky, rendered in sickly yellows and greens, creating an atmosphere so toxic it looks chemically altered. That is London's air. The coal smoke from thousands of factories and homes combining with fog to create what residents called pea soup, a mixture that killed hundreds every winter through respiratory failure. A visible manifestation of industrial progress poisoning the people who made it possible. Those masses marching in organized formations toward the palace, celebrating rather than fleeing, participating in their own damnation with military precision. Those are British citizens, going to work in factories that poison the air, drawing water from a river that carries cholera, following the patterns society established for them because everyone else follows those same patterns, marching toward a system that kills them while believing they are building something glorious. And Satan himself, standing isolated on those jagged rocks, observing what he created with that expression of resignation or contemplation, separated from his palace by the very river that defines his kingdom. That is everyone who sees the problem and cannot fix it. Everyone who designs solutions that get rejected. Everyone who watches their city become hell and can do nothing but document it. This is not the capital of hell. This is the capital of the British Empire. And Martin is saying they are the same thing. Everything you thought you were looking at has changed. The painting has not changed. Your understanding of it has. What seemed like biblical mythology is actually contemporary documentation. What looked like fantasy is political satire. What appeared to be hell is London. The genius of this painting is not just in the technical execution, though Martin's skill is undeniable. The genius is in the double vision. You can look at this as a biblical scene from Paradise Lost and appreciate it as a dramatic visualization of Milton's text. Or you can recognize what Martin actually painted and see it as one of the most savage political statements ever created by a British artist. Both readings are correct. Both exist simultaneously. Satan's Pandemonium and Victorian, London occupy the same canvas, separated only by your willingness to see the connection. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That Gothic architecture is not just similar to Westminster. It is Westminster, modified and placed over fire to show what it truly represents. That polluted atmosphere is not just hellish. It is historically accurate to London's industrial smog. That toxic river is not just symbolic. It is a precise rendering of what the Thames had become. Martin painted prophecy disguised as mythology. He painted documentary disguised as fantasy. He painted the truth about his society in a form that allowed him to exhibit it publicly, to hang it in the Royal Academy, to force the people responsible for London's condition to look at what they had created. Some understood immediately, some were outraged. Some praised the technical skill while missing the message entirely. But the painting hung there, in public view, showing everyone who looked at it exactly what their city had become. A palace rising from poison, a government elevated above suffering, a system that valued grandeur over human life, and the masses kept marching toward it. But to fully understand why Martin chose this specific approach, why he painted Westminster as pandemonium rather than simply creating a straightforward political cartoon or pamphlet, we need to understand where this image came from. We need to look at the literary source that Martin was working from, because pandemonium is not Martin's invention. The word itself, the concept of hell's capital, the image of Satan building a palace in the underworld, all of this comes from a poem written nearly 200 years before Martin picked up his brush. A poem that every educated person in Victorian Britain would have known by heart. A poem about rebellion, about the fall from grace, about the choice to reign in hell rather than serve in heaven. Paradise Lost by John Milton. And what Martin understood, what he embedded in every brushstroke of this painting, is that Milton's Satan and Victorian Britain were asking the same question, making the same choice, building the same doomed paradise. Paradise Lost was published in 1667 by John Milton, a blind poet writing in the aftermath of England's Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy. It is an epic poem in 10 books, later expanded to 12, that attempts to justify the ways of God to men by retelling the story of humanity's fall from grace. But what made Paradise Lost dangerous, what made it controversial from the moment it was published, was that Milton's most compelling character is not God or Adam or the angels. It is Satan. Milton's Satan is not the cartoonish devil of medieval art, not the horned beast torturing sinners for eternity. He is complex, tragic, almost sympathetic, a figure who chose freedom in damnation over servitude in paradise. A rebel who knew he would lose and fought anyway, because submission was worse than defeat. The most famous line from the entire poem comes from Satan's mouth as he surveys hell for the first time after being cast out of heaven. Quote, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," end quote. This is the philosophy that drives everything Satan does in Milton's poem. He has lost the war. He has been thrown into the pit. He and his fellow rebels have been stripped of their angelic forms and transformed into demons. They have nothing left except the choice of how to respond to their defeat. And Satan chooses defiance. He chooses to build, to create something in hell that rivals what exists in heaven, to establish a kingdom, a government, a capital city that proves he does not need God's grace to create magnificence. So he gathers his fallen angels, and they construct pandemonium. Milton describes it rising from the burning lake, a palace of gold and precious stones that appears overnight through demonic engineering. Thousands of fallen angels shrink themselves to fit inside its halls. Satan sits on a throne and addresses them like a king addressing parliament, asking what they should do next, how they should respond to their exile, whether they should continue fighting or accept their new circumstances. It is, quite explicitly, a scene of political debate, of governmental procedure, of rulers consulting with those they govern about the direction of their shared future. Milton, writing in the 1660s after witnessing the execution of King Charles III and the brief establishment of a Commonwealth government, was thinking about politics when he described hell's capital. And so was John Martin when he painted it in 1841. Look at that book, Paradise Lost. The edition you are seeing is from the 17th century, printed in London, with Milton's portrait engraved on the frontispiece. This text was everywhere in Victorian England. Educated people memorized passages. Artists illustrated scenes from it. Politicians quoted it in speeches. It was considered one of the greatest works in the English language, but different readers took different messages from it. Some saw it as a religious text, a poetic exploration of Christian theology and the nature of sin. Others saw it as a political allegory, with Satan representing republican ideals, rebellion against tyranny, the refusal to submit to absolute authority. The Romantics, the poets and artists of the early 1800s, loved Satan. They saw him as a heroic figure, a rebel who chose authentic damnation over false paradise. William Blake famously wrote that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, suggesting that the poet had accidentally made his villain more admirable than his god. Martin knew all of this. He had spent years creating engravings to illustrate Paradise Lost. Massive mezzotint prints showing the creation of light, the expulsion from Eden, the war in heaven, the construction of pandemonium. These illustrations were hugely popular. They established Martin's reputation as a painter of sublime catastrophe, of apocalyptic scale, of tiny human figures dwarfed by cosmic events. But when Martin painted Pandemonium in 1841, he was not just illustrating Milton's poem, he was translating it. He was taking Milton's political allegory about rebellion and power and government, and updating it for Victorian Britain. He was asking the same question Milton asked in the 1660s. What happens when the people in power choose to reign over hell rather than serve the common good? What happens when a government values its own prestige over the welfare of those it governs? What happens when leaders build palaces while their citizens die from preventable diseases? Milton's Satan chose hell because he preferred freedom in damnation to servitude in heaven. But what freedom did he actually gain? He rules over a kingdom of suffering. He sits on a throne in a palace built over burning lakes. He has separated himself from everything good and true and life-sustaining in order to maintain his pride, his autonomy, his refusal to submit. Martin saw Victorian Britain making the same choice. They could have built sewers, they could have cleaned the Thames, they could have regulated factory emissions and improved public health and created infrastructure that would save thousands of lives. But that would have required submission to practical necessity over political prestige. It would have meant spending money on the poor instead of on ornamental government buildings. It would have meant admitting that something was wrong, that the system was failing, that change was necessary. Instead, they chose to reign over hell. They built Westminster while the Thames flowed with sewage. They constructed the most elaborate Gothic palace in Europe while cholera killed their citizens. They chose grandeur in damnation over humility and service. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Better to have the most beautiful government building in the world rising from a poisoned river than to have a functional sewer system in a less impressive structure. This is what Martin understood about Milton's text. This is what he embedded in his painting. Satan's choice and Britain's choice were the same choice. The philosophy was identical. Only the setting had changed. And just as Satan in Paradise Lost gathers his followers and convinces them that hell is actually glorious, that their damnation is actually freedom, that their suffering is actually triumph, so too did Victorian Britain convince itself that industrial pollution was progress, that the Thames was just an unfortunate byproduct of economic growth, that the death toll was acceptable if it meant maintaining their position as the most powerful empire on Earth. The masses kept marching toward the palace, just like the demons in Milton's poem, just like the figures in Martin's painting, and the rulers sat elevated above it all, separated from the consequences by their wealth and position, just like Satan on his throne in Pandemonium, just like the Palace of Westminster lifted above the Thames on those Gothic arches. But Paradise Lost was not the only thing Martin was thinking about when he created this painting. It was not his first apocalypse. It was not his first vision of civilization collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. Because for more than a decade before painting Pandemonium, John Martin had been painting the end of the world over and over again. and every single time, he was painting the same thing. Pandemonium was not Martin's first apocalypse, not even close. For over a decade before painting this, Martin had been obsessed with catastrophe, with the end of civilizations, with the moment when everything collapses, when cities fall, when empires crumble, when the world itself breaks apart under divine judgment or natural disaster, or the accumulated weight of human sin. He painted it over and over again. Different subjects, different historical moments, different theological frameworks, but always the same fundamental vision. Tiny human figures dwarfed by massive architecture or geological formations or cosmic events beyond their comprehension or control. This was his signature. This was what Victorian audiences came to see when John Martin exhibited a new work. They wanted scale. They wanted sublimity. They wanted to feel small and terrified and awed by forces larger than themselves. And Martin gave it to them. In the 1820s, he created a series of massive mezzotint engravings, illustrating Paradise Lost. These were not small book illustrations. These were large prints meant to be framed and displayed, works of art in their own right that happened to be based on Milton's text. Look at this one. The creation of light. God appearing in radiant glory as darkness is pushed back to the edges of creation. The composition is almost abstract in its use of light and shadow. Beams of illumination cut through cosmic darkness, and there, barely visible at the bottom of the image, are suggestions of angelic figures. Tiny witnesses to an event so massive, it fills the entire universe. This established everything Martin would do for the rest of his career. The dramatic lighting, the extreme contrast between light and dark, the sense of infinite space, the reduction of human or angelic figures to microscopic scale against cosmic backgrounds, the feeling that you are witnessing something beyond human comprehension. The Victorian public loved these prints. They bought thousands of copies. They hung them in their homes. They studied the details with magnifying glasses, finding tiny figures and hidden elements that Martin had embedded in the shadows. These images became part of popular culture, referenced in literature and theatre and political cartoons. Martin had found his niche. He was the painter of the sublime, the artist who could make you feel the terror and beauty of divine power, or natural catastrophe or historical collapse. So he kept painting apocalypse. He painted the great day of his wrath, showing the earth itself splitting apart during the biblical end times. Mountains crumbling, cities sliding into chasms, humanity crushed beneath the geological catastrophe as angels sound trumpets overhead. The sky tears open. The ground becomes liquid. Nothing survives. He painted Belshazzar's feast, depicting the moment when ancient Babylon's king sees the writing on the wall, predicting his empire's fall. A massive banquet hall, filled with thousands of figures, all frozen in terror as supernatural handwriting appears on the palace wall. The architecture is enormous, ornate, covered in decorative excess, and within hours of this scene, according to biblical narrative, the entire civilization would be conquered and destroyed. Empires falling, worlds ending, civilizations collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance or sin, or refusal to acknowledge warning signs. Martin painted this theme in different contexts, different historical moments, different religious frameworks, but the message was always the same. When societies choose pride over wisdom, grandeur over substance, appearance over function, they build their own destruction. They create the conditions for their own apocalypse, and then they act surprised when it happens. But here is what made Pandemonium different from all those other apocalyptic paintings. The great day of his wrath was about the future, a prophesied event that had not happened yet. Viewers could look at it and feel thrilled by the spectacle while knowing they were safe. That this was distant, theoretical, not something they needed to worry about in their daily lives. Belshazzar's feast was about the past, an ancient civilization that fell thousands of years ago. Viewers could enjoy the drama while maintaining comfortable distance. This happened to other people, in other times, in other places. Nothing to do with Victorian Britain. But pandemonium was happening right now. That palace was being built on the Thames while Martin painted it. That river was flowing with sewage while viewers looked at the painting. Those masses were marching through London's streets, working in London's factories, dying from London's diseases. That polluted sky was the actual colour of London's air on bad days. This was not biblical prophecy. This was not ancient history. This was documentary. This was journalism disguised as mythology. This was Martin holding up a mirror and showing Victorian Britain exactly what it had become. And no one was listening. They praised the technical skill. They admired the dramatic composition. They compared it to his earlier apocalyptic works and noted the familiar Martin style. They bought prints. They wrote reviews. They discussed the painting at parties and exhibitions. But they did not clean the Thames. They did not build the sewers. They did not regulate the factories. They did not change anything. They looked at a painting of their city as hell and thought it was fantasy. And Martin knew they would. He knew that people see what they want to see, that spectacular apocalypses are entertaining when they are safely distant, that no one believes the disaster applies to them until it is too late. But he painted it anyway, because sometimes the act of documentation is its own form of resistance. Sometimes showing people what they refuse to see is the only tool available. Sometimes all you can do is create the evidence, preserve the warning, and hope that eventually someone will understand. The painting was not enough to change anything in 1841, but it was enough to be right. And 17 years later, when everything Martin predicted came true, when the Thames became so toxic that Parliament itself had to acknowledge it, when thousands more had died from diseases that proper sewers would have prevented, the painting would still be here, still showing exactly what he tried to warn them about, still proving he was right all along. There is one detail most people never see when they look at pandemonium. Something Martin created that completes the vision, that transforms this from a painting into an immersive experience. Something that suggests the horror cannot be contained within the canvas itself. The frame. Look at it. This is not a standard gallery frame added by a museum or collector after the fact. This is not a simple border designed to protect the edges of the canvas. This was designed by John Martin himself as an integral part of the artwork. And when you see it in person hanging in the Louvre, you understand that the painting does not stop at the edge of the canvas. The darkness is escaping. The frame is ornate, heavily carved, covered in decorative elements that echo and expand the visual language of the painting itself. But these are not neutral classical motifs. These are not innocent flourishes. Look closely at what Martin had carved into this gilded border. Serpents, dragons, twisted creatures winding through the ornamental patterns. Demonic forms emerging from the decorative vocabulary of respectable Victorian frame-making. The same corruption that appears subtly in the palace architecture, those serpentine details worked into the Gothic tracery. Here they are explicit, undeniable, crawling across the border between the painting and the real world. The message is clear. What you are looking at in the painting is not safely contained within the rectangular space of the canvas. It is not a window into another world that you can walk away from when you are done viewing. The horror, the warning, the vision of hell, it's breaking through the frame. It is entering your space. It is refusing to remain merely aesthetic. This is the moment when documentary becomes prophecy, when observation becomes warning, when the painting stops being something you look at and becomes something that looks back at you. Martin understood that a painting could be more than a picture. It could be an environment, an experience, a complete artistic statement that includes the frame, the viewing context, the psychological impact on the audience. Victorian viewers would not have seen this hanging on a white museum wall under neutral lighting. They would have seen it in dim gallery spaces, probably by candlelight or early gas lamps, with the gilt frame catching and reflecting that flickering illumination. The serpents would have seemed to move in that shifting light. The carved details would have appeared to writhe. The boundary between the painting and the frame would have blurred as shadows danced across both surfaces. And the viewer would have understood, perhaps unconsciously, that they were not looking at a historical scene or a biblical illustration. They were looking at something that was happening. Something that refused to stay contained. Something that was breaking free. The frame says, "This is not over. This is not finished. This is not safely in the past or comfortably in the realm of fantasy. What you are seeing is present, immediate, ongoing. And it is coming for you whether you acknowledge it or not." Milton's Pandemonium was a city built in hell after Satan's fall, a completed structure in a completed damnation. But Martin's Pandemonium is still being built, still rising, still expanding. The darkness is still spreading. The pollution is still choking the sky. The masses are still marching. The river is still flowing with poison. And the frame, with its carved serpents and dragons, announces that the borders are failing. That hell is not staying put. That what happens in the painting is connected to what happens in the world outside the gallery. This is not just a painting. This is a prophecy breaking free from its borders. And when you stand in front of it in the Louvre today, almost 200 years after Martin created it, you can still feel it. That sense that the frame is not containing the image, that the darkness is not safely locked away in oil paint and varnish, that the warning is still active, still relevant, still true, because nothing has changed. We still build palaces while rivers die. We still choose grandeur over function. We still march in organized formations towards systems that poison us while telling ourselves we are building something glorious. We still separate those who govern from those who suffer the consequences of governance. We are still in the painting, and the frame with its serpents crawling across the gilt surface reminds us that we never left. But before we talk about what the painting means today, we need to address what happened after Martin painted it. We need to talk about whether he was right, whether his prophecy came true, whether the warnings he embedded in every brushstroke were justified, or if he was just an artist with apocalyptic tendencies seeing disaster where none existed. We need to talk about what happened to the Thames, and we need to talk about the moment when the British government, sitting in that Gothic palace Martin painted as the capital of hell, was finally forced to admit that everything he said was true. 17 years after Martin painted Pandemonium, in the summer of 1858, everything he predicted came true. It became known as the Great Stink. The summer of 1858 was unusually hot. Temperatures in London climbed higher than they had in years, and the River Thames, already contaminated with decades of accumulated sewage and industrial waste, began to heat up. The pollution that normally flowed downstream toward the sea slowed in the summer drought. The water level dropped, the waste concentrated, and the smell became unbearable. Not just unpleasant, not just offensive, unbearable. People on the riverbanks vomited from the stench. Workers refused to go near the water. Boats stopped operating because crews could not function while breathing the contaminated air. The odor penetrated buildings. It soaked into clothing. It made eating impossible because everything tasted like sewage. And the Palace of Westminster sat directly on the riverbank. Parliament tried to continue operating. They hung curtains soaked in chloride of lime over the windows to mask the smell. It did not work. The stench penetrated anyway. Members of Parliament stood at their posts gagging, holding handkerchiefs over their faces, trying to conduct government business while the river Martin had painted as molten lava 17 years earlier literally forced them out of the building. They had to close Parliament. The British government, the most powerful governing body on earth, could not function because the river flowing past their ornate Gothic palace had become so toxic that simply being near it made people physically ill. This is what Martin painted in 1841. This exact scenario. A palace rising from a river of death. A government building elevated above poison. separated by arches, trying to maintain the illusion that the contamination below had nothing to do with the power above. But in 1858, the illusion failed. Because when the river becomes so toxic that you cannot ignore it anymore, when the smell penetrates your curtains and your chloride-soaked barriers and your carefully maintained distance, when the pollution forces you out of your palace, you can no longer pretend the problem does not exist. Parliament was finally forced to act. They passed legislation to build a comprehensive sewer system for London. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed it. It took years to construct. Miles and miles of underground brick sewers that would carry waste away from the Thames. Treatment facilities that would process sewage before it entered the water. Embankments along the riverbanks to control flooding and improve drainage. It was brilliant. It was detailed. It worked. It was also almost identical to what John Martin had proposed in the 1820s and 1830s. The same basic structure, the same understanding of how waste needed to be moved and processed. The same recognition that the Thames could not continue to function as an open sewer if London wanted to survive as a city. Martin had been right about all of it. The river was killing people. The government was ignoring it. The problem would get worse. Eventually it would become so severe that even those in power would be forced to acknowledge it. He was right, but he was 30 years too late to save the people who died waiting for anyone to listen. Thousands of Londoners died from cholera and other waterborne diseases between Martin's proposal in the 1820s and the construction of Bazalgette sewers in the 1860s. Thousands of preventable deaths. Thousands of people who would have lived if the government had acted when Martin first showed them the problem, instead of waiting until the smell became politically impossible to ignore. That palace Martin painted rising from molten rivers, it was built. It still stands on the Thames today, just as Gothic and ornate and vertically imposing as he rendered it in 1841. Those arches lifting it above the water, they are real. You can see them if you visit London. The building looks exactly like Martin painted it. And for 17 years, it sat on the bank of a river that was literally hell. A river of disease and death and accumulated waste. A river so toxic it eventually forced Parliament itself to evacuate. Everything in the painting came true. The palace over the poisoned river. The polluted atmosphere choking the city. The masses marching in organized formations towards systems that were killing them while believing they were participating in something glorious. The separation between those who govern and those who suffer. All of it. Real. Documented. Proven. Martin saw the future by painting the present. He understood that what London was becoming in 1841 would inevitably lead to catastrophe. He tried to warn them through engineering proposals. When that failed, he tried to warn them through art. He painted their government building as the capital of hell and exhibited it publicly and hoped someone would understand what he was showing them. Some did, but not enough. Not the ones with power to change anything. And so the river kept flowing with poison. The palace kept rising in Gothic splendor. The masses kept marching. And Martin's painting hung in galleries, first in London, then in Paris, showing anyone willing to look exactly what was happening and exactly what would happen if nothing changed. The painting was right. Martin was right. The warning was accurate. The prophecy came true. But prophecy does not matter if no one acts on it. Warning does not save lives if people ignore it. Being right does not prevent disaster if society chooses to reign in hell rather than serve the common good. And that brings us to now, to today, to the reason this painting created in 1841 still matters in the 21st century, because we are still building palaces over poisoned rivers. We are still choosing grandeur over function. We are still ignoring warnings from people who see the disaster coming. We are still marching in organized formations toward our own destruction, while telling ourselves we are building something glorious. We are still in the painting. And the question Martin asks, The question embedded in every brushstroke of Pandemonium is the same question Milton asked in Paradise Lost 300 years ago. Is it better to reign in hell than serve in heaven? Is it better to rule over poison than submit to the practical requirements of keeping people alive? Is it better to build ornate palaces than functional sewers? Is it better to maintain prestige than prevent catastrophe? Victorian Britain answered that question. They chose the palace, they chose hell, and thousands died as a result. What are we choosing today? Look at the painting one last time. Really look at it. That palace rising from rivers of fire. Those masses marching in organized celebration toward their own destruction. That polluted sky. That barrier of death separating those who rule from those who suffer. Satan standing isolated, watching what he built with an expression that might be satisfaction or might be regret. This is not a painting about hell. This is a painting about choice. The choice to build palaces instead of sewers. The choice to value appearance over function. The choice to reign over poison rather than serve the common good. The choice to ignore warnings until catastrophe forces acknowledgement. Victorian Britain made that choice. They built Westminster while the Thames flowed with death. And they paid for it with thousands of lives and 17 years of denial before the Great Stink forced them to act. But we are making the same choice right now, today. Climate scientists are showing us data, giving us warnings, designing solutions, just like Martin showed Parliament his sewer designs. Just like he painted this prophecy and exhibited it publicly, hoping someone would understand. And we are building palaces, debating costs, prioritizing short-term economics over long-term survival, telling ourselves the problem is not that severe, that the warnings are exaggerated, that we have time to address it later. We are those masses marching toward the palace, participating in systems we know are unsustainable because everyone else is participating too. Following patterns, society established because questioning them feels too difficult, too disruptive, too expensive. Martin saw the future by painting the present. He understood that societies choose their own apocalypses by refusing to acknowledge what artists and scientists and engineers are trying to show them. He painted Westminster as Pandemonium because that is what it was. A government choosing to reign over hell rather than serve the people it was supposed to protect. And artists are still doing this, still showing us what we refuse to see, still documenting the present in ways that reveal the future, still painting prophecies disguised as mythology, hoping someone will recognize the warning before it is too late. The painting hangs in the Louvre today. Millions of people walk past it every year. Most see a dramatic biblical scene, appreciate the technical skill, maybe read the placard explaining it is based on Paradise Lost, and move on to the next gallery. But now you know what you are actually looking at. You are looking at a documentary, a warning, a prophecy that came true, a painting that shows exactly what happens when societies choose pride over wisdom, grandeur over substance, political prestige over human life. You're looking at Victorian London disguised as hell, or perhaps hell disguised as Victorian London. The difference does not matter because Martin is saying they are the same thing. And the question the painting asks is still relevant, still urgent, still unanswered. What warnings are we ignoring today? What disasters are we building toward while telling ourselves we are building progress? What artists, what scientists, what engineers are trying to show us solutions that we are rejecting because they seem too expensive, too radical, too disruptive? What is our Thames? What is our Great Stink? What will it take before we are forced out of our palaces and made to confront what we have been ignoring? Martin painted the answer. It takes catastrophe. It takes death. It takes suffering so severe that even those protected by privilege cannot ignore it anymore. But it does not have to be that way. We could listen to the warnings before the disaster arrives. We could choose function over grandeur. We could build the sewers instead of the palaces. We could serve the common good instead of reigning over poison. We could choose heaven over hell. But first, we have to recognize what we are looking at. We have to see the palace for what it is. We have to acknowledge the river flowing beneath it. We have to understand that the masses marching in celebration are marching toward catastrophe. We have to see what John Martin painted in 1841 and recognize that we are still in it, still building pandemonium, still choosing to reign in hell, still ignoring the prophets showing us exactly where this leads. The painting is a mirror. The question is whether we are willing to look. So here is what I want to know. What do you think we are ignoring today that future generations will look back on the way we look back on Victorian London, ignoring the Thames? What are the artists and scientists trying to show us right now that we are refusing to see? What is our version of this painting? What warnings are being dismissed as exaggeration or fantasy that will turn out to be documentary? Leave your answer in the comments, because these conversations matter. Because recognizing the pattern is the first step toward breaking it. Because maybe, if enough people see what Martin saw, understand what he was warning us about, we can choose differently than Victorian Britain did. If you want more deep dives into paintings that reveal uncomfortable truths about the societies that created them, subscribe to Hollow Frames. Because art history is not just about appreciating beauty or learning about techniques. It is about understanding that artists have been documenting our failures, warning us about our disasters, and showing us our reflection for centuries. We just have to be willing to look. This is pandemonium. This is London. This is hell. This is us. And the question John Martin asked in 1841 is still waiting for an answer.